Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week of Sustainability Happy Hour. I'm one of your hosts. I'm one of your hosts who's losing his earpiece. Pat Keys. I'm the lead scientist at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, and this is my co-host,
Micah Bennett. I am the communication specialist at said school.
SoGES. That's what we say.
We're really trying to push that. We're really trying to get that into the lexicon.
15.
Yeah. Well, to whoever might be watching right now, which is probably a lot of people, welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome to the happy hour. We have a very fun guest today. We're actually going to be interviewing our very own Associate Director of SoGES, Peter Backlund. Drum roll. And I actually have no idea if I'm pronouncing his last name right. So we'll find that out when he comes on. How you're supposed to say his
He's just going to yell at you.
Yeah.
He's going to yell at you.
You worked here for 9 months.
You can just blame the pandemic. You can be like, "This is a pandemic,"
Right. I got sent home 3 months into this job, and then I never saw any of your faces again.
That's right. Okay, but as usual, we should start with some very serious fun facts.
Very serious. Do you want to go first or second?
Second.
Okay. So my fun fact has to do with the fact that I'm currently I'm taking a class at CSU, a graduate class. I might have talked about it already. I can't remember the exact name of the class because it's a very long title, but is essentially we're learning all about Aldo Leopold and like the development of wildlife conservation. And so I've been thinking a lot about wildlife and wild critters lately. And recently, like within the last couple of years, I learned how cool possums are. I might have already talked about possums actually on this show.
I don't think we've talked about possums.
Okay.
If you have, pretend like we haven't. Yeah.
So my fun fact today is simply to ask you, Pat, if you have a moment to talk about our friend the possum.
I have lots of moments to talk about possums.
Great.
Possums or possum? What is the plural form of possum?
I think I don't know.
Let's just say possum. Possums? Yeah. Possums.
So anyways, a lot of people are grossed out by possums, as was I.
Why?
Through most of my life. Because they look kind of like giant rats. And they're quite ugly, actually. But then I learned some really amazing facts about possums. One is that they're the only marsupial in the United States. So similar to like kangaroos in Australia, they hold their young in their little pouches, their little joeys. They also do not carry diseases and are like way less likely to carry rabies than say like a raccoon or even like a stray dog.
Oh, yeah, that is interesting.
Mm-hmm. And what's really cool is that they eat ticks. They eat ticks by the thousands. And
no, they really?
Yes.
Like the ticks that attack us?
Yes, like wood ticks. And if there's anything that grosses me out more than this world, it's wood ticks.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And so they're really quite friendly.
Wow.
And they're just really good animals. And so if you can like not kill them on your property, it would be ideal. They can be kind of a nuisance. Yeah. They get into trash like raccoons do. But for a visual, I just found this Twitter page. It's called Possum Every Hour. And you can just scroll down a little bit. There's nothing crazy down there.
Well, first I'm going to click follow. Done. Okay.
And I think it's just a page where this user posts a picture of a possum every hour.
That sounds like so much work.
I'm sure he's got like an algorithm. Or she has
look at this one. It's wearing a helmet.
And the more you look at them, like they're so ugly, they're cute. Right? Like, look at those little teeth.
They don't have to convince me that they're good looking or anything. The fact that they eat ticks is like,
yes,
that's just extraordinary.
And on a personal note, my family growing up had some like outdoor cats. We lived out in the country.
Yeah.
And my parents still have an outdoor cat that comes inside, is actually inside more than outside. But anyways, when she's outside during the day alone, they are fairly certain that she has curled up in her little cat house with a possum in the winter to stay warm. And they've like become buddies, and it will occasionally eat our food, our cat food.
That is kind of adorable.
It's kind of adorable. Probably not very good for like, domesticating.
But they don't carry
wildlife.
diseases, right? Like,
Right.
who
Anyways,
doesn't want a pet possum?
the
Okay, this is
possums
cool.
are great. That's my message for the day.
That's a good fun fact. Slash important PSA. Okay, so my fun fact, I was struggling to come up with a fun fact today, is that it's not related to the environment at all, I don't think.
They don't have to be.
It doesn't. They don't have to be. Okay.
No.
I was talking to Micah about this Halloween decoration that I have right here, and no, this is not a real skull. It is a 3D printed skull. You can actually see. Look at that. You can see the cross hatching. That's actually the different.
Kind of looks. I was just gonna say, kind of looks like it got cut off. Yeah, like someone cut off the top of it.
Yeah, well, it's because there was an error in the 3D printer, and so it stopped printing right there, and so now we just have like a flat top. But a few years ago, my wife got me a surprise present for Christmas one year, a 3D printer, and I'd never like done it before, so it was just sort of like out of the blue. And I think she thought like I would be kind of interested, like fun little present. Right. And I just got like obsessed. And so I was like 3D printing everything. I was like, oh, we need a replacement for that thing. Let me see if I can 3D print that.
And it turns out like, you can.
You can. And I would spend probably too much time trying to troubleshoot and make it just the right size and everything. But it is actually it's a really cool technology. And since I got my first one, I got I graduated up, but got a cheaper one that was a little bit more DIY. But the technology has moved so fast now. You can print with different kinds of materials now. I think that 3D printing in the future, like the next 10 or 20 years, is going to be one of those things where we sort of get blindsided by how much it can replace other forms of manufacturing. Not to say that everybody's going to have a 3D printer in their house to make little Halloween skulls. But maybe, they would have them more commonly elsewhere. And I guess we're seeing that in libraries, universities, it's very common now. I think actually at my son's elementary school, they've got like a whole 3D printing lab, and it's sort of.
That's so cool.
I know, it's pretty cool.
Like
and he's like
water
elementary school, right?
Sand tables.
I know we had sticks and dirt that we played with when we were in elementary school. No, we also had wooden play sets. Anyway, 3D printing, it's a hobby that takes too much time.
I love it.
Okay, but moving on to important things like the news. We've got 2 news articles we're going to talk about today. And should I take the lead on the news?
Well, why don't you do yours? We each kind of found one. Why don't you do yours, yeah, and then I'll do mine.
Okay. Well, why don't you go first, actually, because mine's maybe a little bit more upbeat than yours.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Mine is so our guest today, Peter, works with climate. And so I tried to find something kind of climate related. And I actually found, it's got an interesting title, Hijacked by Anxiety, How Climate Dread is Hindering Climate Action, in The Guardian. And this one stuck out to me because actually that's something I feel very personally, and I didn't know there was a term for it, and it's climate dread. And it's the sense of dread or gloom and like sort of paralyzation that happens when people start to really think about like the existential threats our planet is facing with climate change. And what this article does is it talks about it from a psychological perspective, how it is kind of like its own form of anxiety, in a way, its own form of trauma, like climate trauma. And some of the big takeaways is that because the human psyche is hardwired to disengage from things that are uncomfortable to protect itself, that's what people do when they start to get overwhelmed by climate dread, is they start to disengage. They think this is a problem that's so big, I can't do anything. And so it actually really hinders action. And a lot of people that are well aware of the science and well aware of what we're facing and want to do things about it can't, because they're kind of paralyzed by this dread. And so the article doesn't go into crazy detail about it, but it just talks about how there's one university, I think, that is doing training, psychological training for climate activists to help them better approach people, like the people they're trying to engage in action to sign petitions or start recycling. You have to speak and act in a way that is not going to like trigger that sense of shutdown, and how that's kind of a very delicate balance to strike. And I think that's something that a lot of people have felt for a long time. And it was interesting to find sort of this piece that articulates it like that.
Yeah, one thing I really liked about this was there's one of the people they interview, I think she says that a measure of mental health is having the capacity to accurately emotionally respond to the reality in our world. So it's not delusional to feel anxious or depressed. It's actually mentally healthy, Hickman says. And I was struck by that because I definitely feel this sense, like all of these things they're talking about, like you're in the supermarket, you're thinking about, oh, I can't wait till I can go on this trip, but should I even go on that trip?
Right.
All of these things, I'm very familiar with how all of that feels. I think about it also in the context of my kids. Like, they're going to live for hopefully a lot longer than I am. Like, what's the world going to look like for them? Mm-hmm. And so I totally get this, but it's interesting that they say like all of those feelings are appropriate responses, but you don't want to stop there. You want to figure out how to kind of move past that and maybe harness that and then use that, that care, that emotional engagement that you have and actually move into something more meaningful past that. And I really like that. And actually this made me think a lot. We talked about this with Josh Sabika months ago now about kind of the ongoing and very public and widespread demonstrations on the part of Black Lives Matter specifically, and then kind of racial injustice more broadly. And thinking about how a lot of people feel this, they get shut down because there's so much to care about in a way. It's like, it's okay to feel that much. You just have to then do something with that. And so I'm glad you highlighted this because I think a lot of people probably relate to this and connect with this issue. Can I go into the next article?
Yeah. Do we have time? We have a comment from our audience based on your fun fact.
Yikes. What is it? What do we have? Okay. Julie Kallenberger. It would be interesting to know if 3D printers save on waste since people can replace pieces or parts instead of buying new, or do 3D printers create more waste because people are making random junk? I would definitely say the second one, sadly, right now.
From experience?
What's that from? Definitely from experience because I'm terrible at it. But I think the problem right now, you've got all of these hobbyists like me that are essentially like doing this in kind of whatever free time we have or like on the side. And especially if you're new to it and if you get kind of an inferior printer, then you're going to have a lot of failed prints, especially right at the beginning. And that's actually using wasted material, right? That's plastic. And I think you can get some biodegradable plastic, but that's not as easily accessible. It's also, where do you send that now? And so I think for hobby usage, it almost certainly, yes, it's going to create more waste. But I think for manufacturing, for other things, like if you were able to have sort of trained people that can use these things really well, and rather than say like, oh, this whole contraption that I use, this mechanism is one piece doesn't work, so I have to throw the whole thing away. Yeah, okay, if all you needed was a new latch, then yeah, just go to like your place, you say, this is what I need to print, and then somebody could help you do it. I think if we got to that point in the technology, then it would definitely be a net win for whatever waste and junk and stuff. I think until things are more expensive because of shipping and all of that, like it's so cheap still to just like buy a new one on Amazon than it is to try and fix it, that until things are more expensive for other reasons, that it's gonna take something like that to make us realize like we can't just buy a new one every time because it has all of these other costs, et cetera. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, Julie, but it's a great question. Okay, so the next article I was going to talk about, and then we got to get cruising here, is the Nobel Prizes are being announced right now for different areas of science, and 2 people were awarded the Nobel Prize in chemistry this year, and it's sort of a historic event because it was 2 women, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier. I had to look that up.
Nice.
How to
pretty
pronounce
sure
that.
That was the right one. Yeah.
That's spot on, right? And so these are 2 women that have been awarded the Nobel Prize in chemistry for sort of the discovery and harnessing of the technology of CRISPR. and I cannot remember what CRISPR stands for, but it's a specific technology in genetics where it actually, you can use these, I think these, I'm not even going to try and explain it because I did not win the Nobel Prize in chemistry.
You want to know what, though? I think SoGES held a panel on CRISPR, a Managing the Planet panel, and I think the video is on Facebook if anyone wants to watch it.
Perfect. Go to that to learn more, not from me. But what is important about this technology is it allows you to interact directly with the genome. And so rather than kind of widespread, widely used, and I would say mature kind of genetic modification, genetic engineering technology, you're swapping in, for the most part, kind of whole gene sequences into different genomes. So you might say like, oh, I like that trait from this plant, and I'm going to try and blend that into this genome. Okay. Now some people will show you like a glowing tomato. That's not really happening. But they would take a whole sequence and try and plug that in, whereas CRISPR allows you to kind of snip and adjust things in a much more tailored and specific way. And so for that reason, it's much more precise, and sort of the side effects are much narrower from what I understand. So it's a technology that's much better suited for, say, medicine, or things that we need to use for specific purposes to treat specific diseases. And it's already being used for that. And so these two women are being recognized for a relatively recent discovery as far as kind of Nobel Prizes go. And so I think that's pretty cool. And it's relevant for the SoGES Sustainability Happy Hour, because one of the applications of this would be for very targeted and precise directed applications for, say, crop management. So if you wanted to have more drought-resistant varieties of wheat, then this would be a more tailored, specific approach than, say, perhaps other technologies that we have already. And so there's a huge amount of promise for this technology for all sorts of different aspects of kind of, broadly speaking, environmental science. And I can leave it there, but we'll make sure we have these links posted in sort of the show notes somewhere else. After this broadcast. Cool. But with that, we should go ahead and bring on our guest, right?
I think so. Let's do it.
Okay. So are we good to go? Ready to go? Thumbs up? Peter, we're good? Okay. Okay, we will go. Boom, boom.
Boom.
Welcome, Peter.
Hello.
Okay,
welcome
so
to the show.
Thanks for the show.
Of course. It's been a long time coming. I think we asked you to join us on week 1 of our broadcast, and you're like, you guys need to iron the kinks out.
We're like, will you be our guinea pig, please?
Yeah, you're like, absolutely not, but I'll come on once you know what you're doing. And I don't know, we might know what we're doing now.
You kind of sound like you know what you're doing now, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so why don't really quickly, we gave you a brief introduction at the beginning of the show, but maybe you could just tell us who you are and sort of what you're doing now.
Well, so I'm the associate director of SoGES, trying to get that branding down, Micah. SoGES, the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. I help run the school along with Diana, so I have the pleasure of working with both of you, obviously, and everybody else at the school, and all the students and all the other faculty at CSU. I think I must have one of the coolest jobs at CSU, I think, in many ways. Because I get to interact with so many different people in so many different fields because of the nature of our school, the way that we cut across so many different aspects of it. But my own work can be described, I think, in a number of different ways, but I really work mainly on climate change. And that's been kind of a long evolution of my career, but I've really ended up as a climate change guy. And within that, I really work on the impacts of climate change. So what one of my mentors and someone I respect a lot, the kind of things that she called the so what questions, like what does it mean for society that climate is changing, and what are the implications? So I spend a lot of time working on that. I also spend a lot of time working at the intersection of science and policy. And so that's the other thing. And that's not unusual in the climate change world, although a lot of researchers manage to stay pretty much within the research domain, but it's obviously a very policy relevant topic. And so there's a lot of opportunities to be involved in that. And I've been lucky enough in my career to be able to cross back and forth across that line between the research community and the policymaking community as a staffer on the one hand, and then a manager and administrator of research on the other. And then I've even got to dabble in doing some of my own research, although being a primary original basic researcher has not been the thrust of my career at all. I've been much more of a practitioner. So I've been an agency guy and a big lab guy and a White House guy, and now I'm a university guy, and so that's been, you know, a lot of fun to follow that pathway.
I just wanted to zoom in on that. What you just said is because you've worked in such a huge range of locations, places, and almost disciplines of science policy.
Right.
People say, I want to get into science policy. And that's like this gigantic topic. And it can mean so many things, right? It could mean everything from journalism to still being a basic science researcher, but then maybe you're hoping to work with policy kind of relevance. And you've done so much of that. So it would be really great, I think, for our listeners, and honestly, just selfishly me, I would love to hear how you trace that arc of your career so far. So I don't even know where you start, but I know like these waypoints along the way where you've had these kind of amazing opportunities to work in these different places. So, because I know you've worked in the White House,
right?
You worked at NCAR, you're now at kind of an academic institution, CSU, and I'm sure there are other cool places in the mix. So maybe do you mind kind of just doing like a brief review of some of those places along the way? Because I think for some people, when they think science policy, they have this monolithic, though ill-defined idea of what that means. And it would be great for you to add a little granularity to what could that mean in lots of different contexts.
Yeah, it certainly can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but kind of my arc that brought me to it, I was thinking a little bit about this, and you know, I could go on for the whole time about this, but you know, in kind of super short summary, I was lucky enough to be a real outdoorsy kind of kid. Okay, so you know, I grew up in the 60s and had parents that were very into the outdoors. And so I was exposed a lot to the outdoors when I was a kid. My parents were also huge travelers. They were the kind of parents that would just like throw the kids in the back of the wagon and take off for 2 or 3 months and circumnavigate the country, you know, or go to Mexico or go to Europe. My dad was a professor, so he had a lot of freedom in his job. And so I kind of started very naturally getting a pretty international and global perspective and an outdoor perspective when I was young. And then I'm also very, very interested in art and literature and storytelling and things like that. And so when I was an undergraduate, I studied history. I got really interested in the role of science and technology in history as one of the societal factors that shapes a society and has a lot to do with the arc of the society, actually, is the way they apply or misapply science and technology. So I got really interested in those kind of things. Then when I finished my undergraduate degree in history and I started looking at graduate programs, I was stunned to discover that you could actually study science policy as a thing. And I was torn as a young student between doing what so many of my peers have done, which was dive right into grad school and go get a PhD. And I was really already, as an undergraduate, getting a little bit sick of school. I wanted to do something shorter. So I did a professional master's in science, technology, and public policy at what was at the time one of maybe like kind of, I would say 5 or 10 places where you could really study that.
Where was it?
That at George Washington University in DC. Okay. And it was just an amazing launching pad for me to learn about that. And so primarily what I learned about in school was really the way the government has applied science and technology as a tool and the philosophy and rationale for large-scale government investment in science. A lot of scientists to this day in the U.S. don't realize that the federal government essentially created the modern scientific enterprise in America in the wake. You know, if you really wanted to go deep, you could trace it back to the Civil War, but it was really World War II where modern science was born and the state support of science was born. And before World War II, nobody ever really even thought of having a career as a scientist. People could be inventors. There was agricultural science. There was some practical things like that. But the kind of academic science we have now essentially didn't exist. So that was quite an interesting thing to study. But then you started realizing in the course of studying it and then getting out and working that as well as the government making a very large effort to stimulate science and technology for reasons of the national interest, that science and technology has its own momentum and its own effects in society, many of which don't have much to do with the government and have much more to do with corporate activity and civil society and people just doing things and discovering things. And you realize that science and technology has these, dealing with science and technology is a policy issue as well, and dealing with the effects of science and technology. And as I said before, the misapplication and the successful application of it both. And so, many of the big sustainability problems actually have to do with kind of the misapplication of science and technology and the unintended consequences of scientific and technical decisions. And so that to me is kind of that's what climate change is all about.
I was just going to say, just to provide some context to that, would say the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, represents something like that, where, okay, turns out burning a lot of fossil fuels, one of the side effects, the unintended consequences of that, is our atmosphere is accumulating a lot of those greenhouse gases that are a side effect or a byproduct of burning those fossil fuels. Right. We need to have a way to deal with that. And so the UNFCCC, the UNF
the
Commission,
United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
There we go. So the UNFCCC comes up with, or is responsible for lots of things, including the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? And so that's like a response. Would that be an example of that? So
yeah, it's interesting. What's interesting about the IPCC is it's actually was kind of co-invented by the policy process. As you said, the Framework Convention on Climate Change saw how critical very early on in the negotiations that it was obvious that there was a lot of scientific and technical content to the deliberations and the disputes around climate change. And so, and to the problem definition, right? To coming up with a full definition of the problem. So they realized that they wanted science, but at the same time, the scientists who were working on science relevant to climate change had a great deal of interest in organizing themselves to present the best possible science. And so the IPCC is actually a kind of a partnership between the Framework Convention on the one hand, and then it was things like ICSU, the International Council of Scientific Unions, played a big role at the IPCC, and the World Meteorological Organization also. So it's kind of a partnership of some largely technical bodies with a policy group, and it's really one of the first times. I would say it's actually the second time that there was a major international effort to set up a scientific assessment process to feed accurate information into the negotiation. The first time this happened was around the Montreal Protocol, which deals with regulation of ozone depleting substances, CFCs primarily. And they had a thing called the STAP, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, that was part of that. And that was kind of a model for the IPCC, even though the issues around ozone were very difficult, but not as difficult as climate. But you had this model of the science community organizing itself to present information to the policymakers, and then the policymakers agreeing to take that information on board and use it in the negotiation process, which no one should have any illusions. The negotiation uses science. It is not primarily about science. It's about economics and national interest and things like that, but there's a lot of science content to the negotiation. And so you mentioned earlier the Nobel Prize in Chemistry and this great achievement that the two women were just recognized for, the invention of CRISPR. The person who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry about 30 years ago just died yesterday, a man named Mario Molina. He and Mario Molina, Sherwood Rowland, and Paul Crutzen received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work in identifying the role of CFCs in depletion of stratospheric ozone. And that was the first time a Nobel Prize had ever been given to anyone for environmental science.
Really?
Really?
This day, I think it's the only one that's really been given for environmental science. So
Wow.
they have done. There has been a Nobel Prize in economics awarded for economic analysis around climate change, but it's was interesting, and so that I was really sad to see the news about Mario Molina passing away. He's a very inspirational figure who did a lot, was a great mentor to many young scientists, and was one of these leaders of this process of saying, as a scientist, I want to engage with the people making decisions and present them the best information we have at the time about the issue at hand. And so he was a leader in this, and so deserves to be remembered for that.
Thanks for mentioning that. And if you're just joining us, this is the SoGES Sustainability Happy Hour. We are here with Peter Backlund, the Associate Director of SoGES, and we are talking about all things science policy. If you have a question, go ahead and just punch it in on whatever platform you're using right now, and we'll see it here. And we'll just keep going on ahead. So I do want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about, you actually worked physically in the White House for a little while, right?
I did for 7 years.
7 years.
Like
so
in the building, in the actual building.
I did not work. My office was not in the White House itself. My office was in what's now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, but it used to be called the old Executive Office Building. So it's right next to the White House. It's within the perimeter of the White House complex.
Is that the one that looks like a cake?
It looks like a giant wedding cake. Yes.
Okay.
It's a beautiful building. And
could you just talk to us, like, what does that mean? Okay. So you worked on presumably science policy related topics,
right?
But for the White House, like, so can you walk us through what that actually means?
Yeah. So
either day to day or whatever.
Yeah. So in kind of organizational terms, what brought me there's an office in the White House called the Office of Science and Technology Policy. It's headed by a director who has two jobs. He's the director of OSTP, and he's also, or she, is the advisor to the president on science and technology. So it's a double-headed job. And OSTP is a small agency that basically is responsible for providing advice on any scientific and technical issue to the president and the vice president, and then helping the president and the vice president organize the scientific effort of the U.S. government. So it has the purview to look at any and everything across the government. It's not a powerful agency so much in that it doesn't directly control budgets, but it does have a lot of influence depending on the relationship of the science advisor and the what are called within the building the principals, who are the president and the vice president, the people that actually are the last people in the room when decisions are made. So it's an important advisory function to that. What brought me over there was I was working at NASA with.
Also very cool.
Yeah, that was very cool. I worked at NASA headquarters, and I was working on environmental observations and negotiating agreements to have NASA cooperate with a wide variety of foreign governments and international agencies to create a big global observing system to monitor the environment, which is still going successfully today. I to this day am gratified when I think about the satellites that are flying around that were just plans, and in the PowerPoint age now, you don't even know this, but they were plans what we used to call view graphs, which were transparencies that you could show on an overhead projector that would show the design or show some scientific data. My boss at NASA had the trunk of his car was filled with he's famous for presenting, and he would just before every presentation, he'd go to the trunk and pull out the view graphs he needed and take them in and do it. It was amazing. So
I feel like that would be a step up from my current organizational system, which is all digital anyway.
Right.
But it's just that just sounds a little bit like a nightmare to try and figure out, okay, which giant folder do I need to access that contains the graphs or the duplicates?
A kind of like geological strategy where as long as I kind of have an idea of the depth into the pile.
Oh my gosh.
And then do you draw them with vis-a-vis markers? Do you draw them with vis-a-vis markers to like make your notes?
Not usually.
Oh, I think I have the wrong concept of this then.
Well, but I did early in my career, one of the things I used to do when I worked at NASA, even before I was a civil servant, I would go around to these meetings and I would keep the notes in the negotiations. And we had a guy who was famous in the negotiations. At the end, he would get up with a blank view graph on the overhead and he would draw a picture of the meeting and what had happened. He was an Italian guy, Maurizio Fea, his name was. He was an amazing little graphic artist. And so he would draw a picture of the meeting, kind of like the people that do that for at CSU now. That we have that like draw the meeting as it's happening.
Like graphic recorders.
Yeah. So it was like that. He did that. And actually in climate where I work too, there's a researcher who is retired now, but he was a longtime head of the Earth System Research Lab at NOAA and was so down in Boulder, where I am now, as opposed to Fort Collins. And he was head of what used to be called the Aeronomy Lab. He was a very important researcher on the ozone issue, but he was very famous in the climate negotiations for his hand-drawn pictures of climate phenomena. His name is Dan Albriton. Really? I still have a collection of his view graphs. Anyone that has one has saved them. And when we were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, when I was at the White House, I was on the negotiating team. So I didn't go to Kyoto. I was on the home team running analysis and doing all this stuff there. But that was the first big climate meeting to really get massive press coverage. And some of the press coverage was the kind of like bemused coverage of the meeting. Like, this is a strange thing. And they said the strangest thing was, here the vice presidents here, all these heads of state, and then they have this science guy with these cartoons that he's explaining. and his cartoons were beautiful and accurate. And they showed exactly what you talked about earlier, Pat. He would show smokestacks and fields and the emissions. He would draw them.
Right.
And I mean, they were just amazing. And so for the longest time, that was the state of the art. Dan Albright, hand-drawn pictures. And now we have so many amazing, graphics and visuals and visualizations that everyone can create in our field. But
it's just a testament to like the power of visual communication. And,
absolutely,
that's true.
Even hand-drawn cartoons were so important.
They were. It was amazing experience to get to work with. Like, that's been the coolest thing about my career, actually. It's just getting to work with so many interesting people. And that was the great thing about working at OSTP was we would organize, among the many things we did, we would organize little sessions where we would bring in scientists that had some really interesting result. And we would bring them in and they'd give a little talk to the staffers, or sometimes if they had a really big result, we'd bring them in and they would give a little talk to the president and the vice president. And, that was really fun to be able to try and inject again, to increase the information flow across what is too often a wide divide between the people making political and economic decisions and the scientists thinking about the way things work.
Mm. Okay. So just to be cognizant of the time, not the next step, but a next step was that you spent considerable time working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, right? Yeah. NCAR in Boulder. And then after that, you've come to SoGES. And so I would say, talk about whatever you want in that journey. But sorry, I'm trying to get better lighting here. Which way is the best? But one thing I do want to make sure we talk about is that you actually taught a class last semester on science policy.
I did.
And so I encourage you, just keep going, talk about NCAR, talk about CSU, but I want to make sure we also, I want to hear how that went to teach a class, because you sort of have traced an interesting arc where you actually were literally part of a negotiation team and then providing and shortening the gap between science and policymaking folks. Then you're actually working for science agencies like NASA, and then you've worked for NCAR, and now you're actually sort of training people who presumably might go on to do something sort of like this. So I guess I just wanted to make sure I wanted to provide an outline for things that we could talk about, and then maybe you can just drop in whatever sounds good to you.
Yeah, well, so this arc that I had, right? So I worked at NASA on environmental observations. When I went to the White House, it was to work on environmental observations and to redraft and fix the Earth observation part of what was then that we were doing a consolidated national space policy. So there's another element of science policy is space policy.
Yeah.
And what you do with that. And I don't know if everybody realizes this, but the investments in space dwarf most of the other investments in science and technology, only outdone by high-end military R&D and weaponry. And there's obviously a big overlap with that in space. But the country has spent billions and hundreds of billions of dollars on space activity over the last 40 years. So it's a big area of government, and so I worked on that as well. Then I went to NCAR. I went to the White House from NASA, and where there I kind of started on environmental observations. By the end of my time at the White House, I was working just full time on climate change, almost just all the time. With the only other thing I really worked on was coordinating the science budgets of all the agencies across all environmental R&D. But then that took me to NCAR, and it was great. After 17 years in DC, I grew up in the West, and I went back to DC to go to grad school. And I thought I'd be there 3 or 4 years, and I stayed there 17 years. Very happy to move back west. And NCAR was a fantastic place to work, right? Because I had always seen it as this elite research institution that was producing a lot of the information that I was involved in trying to evaluate and use. And so I got to play a role there in helping to lead that lab for quite a while, and I loved it. It was a lot of fun to actually be able to get in and make the arguments for the kind of science we should do based on my experience. And I was only one voice, and I would never say that policy needs should control the science agenda, but I do think it's an important thing for scientists to think about the implications of their science and to think about big societal issues and how their science could address them. So I'm a big believer in, on the one hand, you can have policy-driven science, which I think is not appropriate. You can have basic research, which is important, but often doesn't, frankly, connect to anything. And then you can have what is often called policy-relevant, or maybe another way to say it would be use-inspired research. And
I like that, use-inspired.
We do a lot of that at SoGES. I love that, and been important to me for a long time, and I would make arguments for that at NCAR, which was really more of a basic research place. But did a lot of interesting work. So that was really fun. And then I came to CSU, and what I realized about CSU after being here for a while now is that it's provided me with the opportunity to integrate all the other stuff that I did. So
really,
I've been able to bring my government experience and bring my kind of big science, NCAR, another attribute of it, it's a big science place, right? Where we have a big, giant Earth system model and big weather models and planes. And, it was about big science and big teams of researchers doing stuff. So I got to bring that experience. And then really what it came down to was everything I worked on before this were all different facets of sustainability. And it was really when I was interviewing for my job at SoGES that this all came clear to me. And I actually think it's probably why I got the job, because I managed to tie all these threads together and say, here's how my experience has formed my view of these big issues that I think are really important. And I do think that in many ways, sustainability is the issue of the 21st century. And I say that as a climate person. I get kind of uncomfortable when people try and make climate change out to be the issue. It's an incredibly important issue. But for one thing, it's not separable from the other environmental changes. Really, this is one of the great lessons of the science of the last 20 or 30 years, is the complexity of the web of these issues and what we've learned about the interlinkages of all the issues and the many dimensions of human influence on the environment all together, right? And so, but it came clear to me that I could do all this. And what you mentioned before, I'm just incredibly excited at the thought of being able to help young people think through some of these issues on their own and provide them with background that would enable them to perhaps take a journey similar to what I did, but much more likely take their own journey in a different way. They can learn something. If I can, I'm just incredibly excited at the idea of being able to do that. And when I came to SoGES, my intent was not to teach. I wasn't hired to teach, but doing this class last spring was a great experience. So, okay. And so it was a science policy class. It looked at both why science and technology is important and how we deal with it, and then what we should do to stimulate it or not. So it looked at, at both the science for policy and policy for science. That was kind of our mantra in the class. And then, as you might expect, climate change was an issue that I highlighted as a very difficult and challenging policy issue with a lot of scientific component. I think it's a quintessential science policy issue, most quintessential because there's not really a single correct answer. There's a lot of suboptimal things that we could do and a lot of more optimal things, and it's kind of a very complex. Devising climate policy is never a simple one-dimensional thing. It's so connected to so many other things that it's very challenging to think it through and analyze and even make recommendations about it. But it was a lot of fun to do that with the students, and I was
no doubt.
I was very, and I know you've had this experience as well, I think, Pat, I was very just kind of awestruck sometimes in class at the conversation that we would get into. This was a class for juniors and seniors, and they had a lot of insight. And so I tremendously enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to maybe doing some more teaching.
Yeah, I hope you can do that again. Okay, we've got a question. Randall Barnes, your background is incredible. Thank you for sharing. In your opinion, is the 3% GDP for science spending a proper goal, or should it be higher or lower, or is such a target even useful?
That's a really good question, and that sounds like such a cliche to say that. I think that I would see kind of like 2 to 3% as the minimum that should be invested in science, and I worry a little bit when we dip below that, and we are below that, and so I worry that we're under investing in science. I worry about it a lot. At the same time, I think that scientists have to get a little better at advocating for themselves. I think there's a little bit of, and I think this is changing, but I think there's been, I don't want to sound too harsh, but I think that scientists have gotten used to being a privileged group and have come to expect the ongoing support without always understanding the amount of work that's required to keep that going. Okay.
I think just
always encourage any young scientists that ever have a chance, if you ever get a chance to interact and advocate, or if you ever get to do one of these things, like they have a thing called CNSF, which is like a congressional NSF thing where they bring a lot of young researchers and they just do a bunch of briefings. If you ever get a chance to just explain about science to decision makers, it's a very valuable activity. And I had a colleague who's now, I believe, the main policy guy and advocate for MIT in DC. He's like the MIT Washington representative, but he used to come to our meetings and he would tell scientists, he'd say, the veterans are in there explaining why it's more important to spend $1 on them than $1 on NASA. And, you better be willing to go in and explain. He's like, you can't just assume, the government doesn't just run on what people think is right. It's an actual negotiation for limited resources, and the people that fight the hardest often win. And so it's a lot of scientists think that kind of engagement is I think maybe beneath them a little bit, but I see that changing a lot.
That's great. Okay, so just to be cognizant of time, I think we could probably keep talking for another hour, but we can't do that. And so I guess any final thing that you would like to talk about with regard to science and policy, maybe something that you're thinking about right now, or a project that you've just completed, or something you'd like to highlight, anything.
Well, I did just finish a project that was kind of cool and made me think about some climate stuff in a different way. So I've part of, for the last 3 years, a project to look at developing a set of indicator data sets that show the impact of climate change on agriculture. And this was supposed to be a 1-year project. It ended up taking 3 years. During the course of the one project, we went through a government shutdown and the pandemic in the course of one project. So it was a lot to deal with, aside from the difficulty of the analysis. But what was really interesting about this was that instead, most of the work that I do is around scientific assessment. So it's not original groundbreaking research. It's meta-analysis of the peer-reviewed scientific literature, looking at what everybody's published and what everybody said about what other people have published, and trying to really establish different levels of confidence for different levels of knowledge around topics, right? And so a lot of the climate assessments that I've been part of, always a big part of it has been the opening section that's like, here's what's going on with climate change, and here's the emissions, and here's the temperature. We didn't even do that in this report. The whole thing started with the premise, science, the science has demonstrated conclusively that climate change is real, it's human caused, it's happening. And we just didn't even deal, that was the opening premise. And then it's like, given that, what are the data sets that can tell you about what climate is doing to agriculture? And so it was just a very different way of looking at the problem. And it took me about, maybe I'm just dense, but it took about halfway through the project before I even really started to think about it this way. And so
it's this report, right?
That's the report right there. And so it came out in at the end of July. It's web published, and it's out there, and it identifies 20 different data sets that show how climate is impacting agriculture. And the other interesting thing about this was that this is the first climate report I've worked on where we made hardly any reference. As a matter of fact, I don't think we show a single global climate model projection for the next 100 years.
Wow.
The focus of this is all on what's happened in the last kind of 30 to 40 years, and then the implication that has, because of momentum and inertia for the next few decades. So it was really about what can we say has changed now? What is showing you the way the change is proceeding? And it was amazing. And the little chart at the top, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but we really looked at these things in two dimensions. One was, how firmly can the change shown in the data, how firm is the link of that change to climate change? So how closely is this data
right here,
climate change? So for instance, one of the ones that I spent a lot of time working on, this was heat-related mortality of agricultural workers. Well, I mean, it's just absolutely clear. There's very robust data when people die from heat-related mortality. I mean, there's some uncertainty around the classification of the deaths and everything, but it's well understood. The link is clear. And then it was also, can you get the data? And that was kind of interesting. In this case, there are these data that are collected and regular, but there are a lot of HIPAA regulations around getting access to health data. So it was kind of interesting. But it was just a very different kind of report in that way, in that it's not trying to convince anyone that climate change is real. It's saying if you're concerned, then here are things that can help you understand what climate change is doing to you. And here's the kind of data you should go look for to understand how climate change is affecting your operation.
That's
and
great.
It worked with things like, the kind of local weather changes being driven by big global scale, increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. It has things about the biophysical response of the plants, the way that bugs and pests are being affected. But then we even have things like looking at the rate of pesticide application. So we're really trying to build in a lot of the societal factors as well.
Yeah.
And so it was very interesting. And it was just frustrating to complete it during the pandemic so that all our interactions around the report have been virtual. And that,
no doubt.
That's just the world we're all in now.
I feel like a lot of what you were just talking about, that report kind of relates back to one of the articles we shared about climate dread, and how this report kind of combats that in a way, in the way it's tailored, in that, like, yes, this is a big problem, but we're pointing out like actionable things that you can either do or research.
Well, and a lot of these things,
was that on your mind when you were doing it, as trying to make it like an actionable?
Yeah, and even though we don't, we were kind of precluded from, we don't make any recommendations or anything like that. Like we weren't even sure that they were going to actually put this report out, right? I mean, this is a big climate report being put in the USDA in the current administration. We didn't know if they would want to issue it, but they did, to their point. But I'm so glad you brought that up, because this whole issue of the climate dread is so important, and it's something that's really disturbing to me. I'm very careful and increasingly concerned. On the one hand, I'm concerned with the dynamic of the failure to take action on climate change, then resulting in issuing of reports and increasingly dire warnings. And so there's this kind of feedback cycle where nothing happens. So then we say, like, it's really serious, and then nothing happens.
Right.
It's really, really serious. And then
didn't do anything, so it's going to get worse.
Serious, there's this escalation in the rhetoric. I'm not accusing the science community of that, but the rhetoric around the science has escalated, and I'm really worried about it. And I honestly don't think that climate change is the end of the world. I think that climate change is a very serious environmental problem that's going to have major impacts, but I think there's a huge range from better outcomes to worse outcomes. And I really don't like the line of thinking like, okay, there's 3 years and then it's all over. I understand the rationale, but I'm concerned about it. And so with this report, yeah, like, one of the cool things about this is the things we're identifying here are very real, but this issue of heat-related mortality I just talked about, of agricultural workers, right? Agricultural workers are about 35 times more likely to die from heat-related mortality than any other workers, right? It's insane. It's by far the most hazardous profession, and people die, and it's going up as it gets warmer. It's not a statistically significant increase in the data that we showed. It's an increase, but it's not statistically significant. But the amazing thing about it is that there's not even a reason for one worker to die. And we don't need any breakthrough. All you need to have no deaths is to have shade and cold water available on the job site, and no one would ever die from this. It's just like the high school football players dying from heat stress on the football field. That should never happen. There are cheap, easy solutions, right? They just need to be implemented. So this is a case where there's a serious problem. It's well documented, and it's actually manageable, right? I mean, it's going to be worse to work outside the hotter it gets, but there are adaptations that can be made.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is something that we often lose sight of in climate. And it's a delicate balance, because you don't want to say, oh, don't worry about it, we can adapt our way out, no problem.
Right.
There are some things we can adapt to, and there are limits, but there are things that can be done, and there's a lot that can be done. And I worry a little bit that we make it out to be like an all or nothing issue, when the reality is that it's going to take 5 to 10 decades of sustained effort to create the kind of sustainable infrastructure we need that will resolve the acceleration of climate change from human activity, but will also create a sustainable world. So there is this still, I hate to be Pollyanna, but there is still this big picture win-win thing that's possible here, even if we haven't preserved every single species, and even if we've lost some things that were wonderful that we shouldn't have lost, we can still have a great world if we get our act together. And that's why
Peter,
it's such a cool field.
I need you to write your memoir called The Next 5 to 10 Decades so that you can encapsulate all of this information.
Easy for me to say.
I didn't mean it that way. But more from the perspective, you can also now include all your juicy nuggets that we can't talk about on shh. But then throughout your career, I'm sure you've got all this cool stuff that you could pepper that with. I'm not kidding. You should actually do this. I think you should actually do this.
Persuading.
But what's that?
Keep persuading me, and I will say, I feel like this has gone very quickly, and so if you ever want to have me come back for another guest spot, I'd be willing to do that. If you want to talk more, I enjoy this. And
completely, yeah. I think this
is a great thing that we're trying to do.
We've got a bunch of people that were like, we want to have you back. Can we have you back? Like, when? And so I think we will definitely have you back. And it might be fun, especially if you're in the midst of teaching your science policy class or something like that, kind of drop in and say, how's it going? You know,
Yeah,
maybe have something, talk about that a bit more. Okay. So the last thing we ask every guest, it's a very serious question. And by that, I mean, it's not so serious. What is one thing during this lockdown pandemic time? Mike is taking center stage. Look at this.
Oh,
I gotcha.
Thank you. I was trying to mute myself. Oh my goodness.
It's okay. So what's one thing that's happened during this pandemic that has been positive? It can be anything, totally unrelated to work, but like something in your life or whatever, the world, that for you has been sort of a bright light, a positivity.
I think that it's given me, it's both stimulated and it's stimulated me to reflect on things more, and it's given me time to reflect a little bit more, you know? So we're all still cranking away on our work at home, but it's an event of this magnitude does make you reconsider a lot of things. And I think it's really made me a more reflective person. It's so easy to get just caught up into your day by day agenda, and there are so many things that we're all trying to do, and it's very frustrating. This whole situation is very frustrating and sad and tragic, but it has I think it's given people, it certainly has given me the opportunity to do some more reflection. And I think it's made all of us realize that many things that we thought are absolutely set in stone and impossible to change are actually much more amenable to change than we would have ever imagined.
That's true. That's
and
true.
So I think that maybe, I really don't want to be the Pollyanna guy, but I think that might be a tiny silver lining in this. It's
That's
not
good.
like, oh, we fixed the environment by stopping driving for 3 months, but it has, I think, pointed towards an adaptability on the part of people that sometimes can get lost in the day-to-day press of things. And so I think that's a real
That's
positive
good.
as well.
That's a really good one. Thanks. Okay, so with that, I just want to say a huge thank you for taking all this time to talk with us. It was a pleasure on our side for sure, and yeah, we will have you back another time.
Okay, keep it going. Isn't this
okay?
Thanks, Peter.
Cheers.
Oh yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Sustainability Happy Hour.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Have a great weekend, Peter.
Have a great weekend, Peter.
You too.
Okay. Wow.
All
that was
right.
a great interview.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got three
pretty cool.
things real quick. What's that?
I said our boss is pretty cool.
Our boss is pretty cool. I mean, we knew that already, but now we know that even more. Okay. So we've got three things that we wanted to touch on really quickly before we let everybody go.
Yep. Just a little billboard header, little plug here. There is still time, CSU faculty, to apply for the 2021 Curriculum and Innovation Grants. These are grants that are being administered by SoGES in partnership with the President's Sustainability Commission to develop existing and new coursework that offer creative approaches to interdisciplinary sustainability content and get students more exposed to complex sustainability concepts. So the deadline is the 15th, which is this coming Thursday.
Yikes. Get them in, guys.
Get them in. Go to sustainability.colostate.edu/curriculum-innovation-grants.
And if you have any questions, you can contact Alita Weller. She is in charge of this, and her email's on the page when you want to get there.
Yep. And then the Africa Center is having an event on October 23rd, I believe. So it's going to be a great virtual lecture by Dr. Karen Bailey from CU Boulder about findings from sub-Saharan Africa on the intersecting goals of well-being and vulnerable populations in equity and conservation.
Cool.
So make sure you sign up for that.
What's that? That's like 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, a little later in October. And then finally, if you like this show and you want to get reminders about when we're going live and who's going to be the guest, you can sign up for email updates at sustainability.colostate.edu/sustainability happy hour. And we
No spaces, just Sustainability Happy Hour.
Yep. And this just subscribes you to just this list. So you won't get a bunch of other stuff from SoGES. This will get you.
Well, I might just bug you with my SoundCloud, but
Pat, you don't
I'm
have
just kidding. I don't have a.
And you don't actually have
SoundCloud.
access to the email, so you can't do that.
Oh no! How am I going to send them my SoundCloud information?
I have the power. So, anyways, do that. Get signed up.
Yes.
So you can have lots of fun with us on Fridays, like we did today.
That's right. And then 2 weeks from now, we're
going to have another guest.
We have another guest. Mary Hill, Professor Mary Hill, is a visiting fellow at SoGES this year, digital, virtual, whatever, visiting fellow. And she's going to talk to us about the nexus of food, energy, and water, particularly in sort of rural America. And then we'll probably touch on some other things related to sustainability and other stuff.
Yeah, she actually gave a virtual lecture for SoGES.
Oh, yeah,
too.
yeah.
So you can go to our website and find that, or also on our YouTube channel if you want to get a little taste for who she is before the show.
Absolutely. Okay, with that, thanks a lot, Micah.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.
Another one in the books. Okay, everybody. TGIF. See you in 2 weeks.
Goodbye.
Bye.